According to Jeff King, the period from around 1967 to 1980 is remembered as an era in which Hollywood produced a relatively high number of innovative films that seem to go beyond the confines of conventional studio fare in terms of their content and style, and their existence as products of a purely commercial or corporate system. For some, this period represented the birth or a rebirth of the Hollywood art film. For others, it was a time in which Hollywood made a gesture towards the more liberal or radical forces in American society. I will explore the dynamics of this emergence of a perhaps new cinema in the 1960s and 1970s, but first I'm going to show you a video that kind of catches you up on classical Hollywood and what standard studio fare was in the decades prior. For those of you who've taken other film history classes, this should be already familiar terrain, but for those who haven't, this should get you up to speed.
Shall we try it right through? Won't you sit down, Mr. Gordon?
By the late 1910s, America's cinema transitioned into what we're familiar with, the booming Hollywood industry. The industry skyrocketed. A key innovation was the addition of dialogue in the late 1920s, which kept the industry afloat, popular, and innovative throughout the Great Depression. The era between 1917 and the late 1940s is commonly referred to as studio system Hollywood. This is when production companies had decade-long contracts with actors, directors, and writers. If you think the movie industry is monopolized now, know that 5 studios had control of absolutely everything in the 1940s. Each major company had ownership of actors, directors, distribution, and even the movie theaters. Creators could only make it in the industry if they stuck with one company for almost their entire careers by signing long-term and sometimes very unfair contracts. Out of this era came classics such as Gone with the Wind, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the original King Kong. One interesting aspect of this time period is that with so many movies being made and so many people flocking to the theater, movie companies could afford producing movies with medium-sized budgets and scripts that weren't necessarily blockbuster material, like Citizen Kane and Casablanca. Nowadays, big companies pool most of their time and resources into several big budget movies a year, which is quite a shame.
1, 2, 3. I know, I'm fine.
The end of this era came from another battle with the courts. The Supreme Court ruled against Paramount Pictures, saying ownership of the theaters and distribution of their films was a restriction of fair trade. This loss of control of distribution protected independent filmmakers, but meant a decline in the big industry. The next hit to movie popularity was television. Television hurt the industry since many people could stay at home to get their entertainment. Movie viewership plummeted. In the 30s, 60% of people went to the movie theaters at least once a week. But since the 1960s, the number has consistently stuck around only 10%. To combat TV, movies had to do what TV couldn't do: big screens and big budgets. The Hollywood epic came into fruition. This is when movies got absolutely insane. CinemaScope lenses stretched the screen to almost twice the size of conventional film. There were movies like Cleopatra in 1963, which was the highest grossing film of the year and still didn't make back its budget. One of its huge 100-foot set pieces had to be built twice in 2 separate countries because the lead, Elizabeth Taylor, got sick.
To recap a few key points from that video, by the late 1950s, Hollywood was reeling from the effects of the Paramount decision. In the decades prior, the studio system was vertically integrated, meaning that one studio produced films, distributed those films, and exhibited those films in theaters that had contract with that one studio. Everyone who worked in or with commercial film industry was legally bound or contractually binded to one studio. 1 out of 5 studios that controlled basically the entire film enterprise. When that changed, after the Paramount decision, theaters started showing films that they thought their audience would enjoy. They were no longer bound to showing whatever films studios told them to, the theaters that they had a studio contract with. Meanwhile, the studios had a self-governed censorship code to avoid government interference into film content. This meant that all studio-made films aimed to make films for a generalized audience. They wanted films to be apolitical, to avoid controversy, and avoid any contact or content that might draw questions of amoralism. There was a lot of concerns in previous decades that Hollywood films were encouraging sex and violence. Therefore, they really worked to limit things like sex, violence, films that were considered critical of the government, critical of American patriotism. So by the 1960s, though, culture had changed significantly, so much that the studio's censorship demands seemed quite antiquated, conservative, and restrained. When films made outside of the studios could suddenly reach audiences, independent producers realized that they could produce competitive content by actually putting that edgy stuff into the films. So they wanted to make films that were sexy, violent, made political comments, things disallowed by the studio system's rigid censorship code. As those films that we'll talk about this week gained popularity, the censorship code was abandoned altogether in favor of the rating system similar to what we have today, where films will be marked PG, PG-13R. Also, the way films were actually made changed with the rise of independent productions. In a studio era, in the studio system, everyone was under contract with a studio. You got your salary from the studio. You worked with directors or crew members who shared a contract with that same studio. On occasion, an actor or director could be loaned to another studio for a specific film, but by and large, everyone worked in-house. By the 1960s, when stars were no longer tethered to studios, when directors were no longer tethered to studios, this all changed. Independent producers would assemble a package instead, consisting of a script, a director, and stars who are agreeing to work on the film on a one-time only basis. And this would all be sent to acquire finance. The producer, rather than a mogul or studio executive, was now responsible for the film, overseeing its progress from conception to exhibition. And many of the big new Hollywood films we will talk about later this week were produced this way, on a gamble. A producer got financing, got stars on board to make something edgy and provocative. Often this took a lot of convincing, but in the case of films like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde, which I'll talk about in the next presentation, this gamble paid dividends and launched many, many careers.
I can also mention that television indeed was a big competitor. Many celebrities who worked in the old film industry found new life on television. Also, when all these sort of radio programs were moving to a new televised format, this opened up a change in radio as well. So suddenly, radio was able to play music, and usually that music was more in line with what young people wanted to listen to, pop and rock and roll. So we see this cultural shift. Film kind of shifting over to television, the film industry struggling, music is being popular on the radio, that kind of relates to challenges posed against the film industry, but this emergent young generation that wanted something different from their culture. So in the 1940s, families started moving to the suburbs. This continues into the 1950s and 1960s. One thing to note, though, is the baby boom generation often produced a lot of kids, and these new suburban developments usually didn't have cinema houses. Most cinema houses were still in urban centers. So families stopped going to the movies as much because they could also just sit home and watch television. So who would go to the movies? Well, usually this new generation of teenagers or people who still lived in urban centers. Now, sometimes theaters would try to do whatever they could to draw people out to those theaters, really force them to leave their homes. So they would put on big spectacles. They would experiment with things like Cinerama or CinemaScope, basically make the screen as wide and dynamic as possible to really encourage the theatrical experience kind of on a bigger scale. Comically, this has led to things like more experiments with 3D, but also things like Smell-O-Vision, which was a failed experiment trying to lure audiences to a new experience in theaters. There was one film produced in Smell-O-Vision, and for reasons you might guess, being overwhelmed with the smells happening in a film didn't go so well. So this was sort of ditched. But you can see here that like theaters in Hollywood was scrambling to get people into theaters. It wasn't just institutional and infrastructural changes to Hollywood that catalyzed the rise of a new type of independent film in the 1960s. There was also a cultural shift in art and image making that impacted Hollywood as well. Films of the 1950s that focused on realistic portrayals of alienated working class characters, like On the Waterfront starring Marlon Brando and Rebel Without a Cause starring James Dean, would prove highly influential predecessors to the new Hollywood films of the following decade. These two actors in particular had also emerged from the school of method acting in New York's theater. working with teachers like Lee Strasberg, who would also work with later New Hollywood actors like Jane Fonda. These actors all created complex and elaborate backstories for their roles, and they thought about character intricacies beyond the Hollywood archetype. They were more than just a type. These types, though, of dynamic performances and character studies would become integral to the goals of New Hollywood explorations of American society and identity. However, it'd be silly to argue that the only films that were popular in the 1950s that would influence New Hollywood were these hyper-realist dramas. B films were incredibly popular with young audiences in the 1950s, films that pushed the boundaries of decency and explored the kind of edges of societal norms, kind of were really popular with young audiences, and the young audiences that would drive theatrical exhibition and wanting new types of cheap, low budget things. The thing is that it turns out teenagers didn't really care about seeing the 10 Commandments as much as they cared about watching a film that could be made for like 20 grand, as long as it had a monster in it. So when Hollywood recognized that there's a market for low budget crap, Hollywood studios would happily turn out more and more low budget crap for those young people. Some of these horror films are really based on also pop novels and comics that were oriented towards youth. Suddenly, in the 1950s and into the 1960s, American cultural industries realized that there was a lucrative market for a younger demographic. Music, media, and television were all sort of oriented more so towards that younger demographic, and films would be as well. I can't also forget to mention that many of the independent productions that would ultimately kind of help contribute to a new Hollywood were also making a lot of kind of low budget biker westerns, and some of the stars like Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, that would become really popular in the New Hollywood era, had first started making films in these kind of like low budget biker contexts. And where could you go to see a biker film or a 1950s kind of low budget sci-fi film? Well, you can go to an inner city theater, or you can go to a drive-in. And a drive-in was really trying to market itself towards a younger audience, a teenage demographic that was also interested in popular music culture. I bring this up because one of the main trademarks of New Hollywood, which you'll see in the next presentation, is their investment in popular culture and popular music, rather than kind of classical orchestral scores that you would see in films in the previous decades. Technological changes also made it a lot easier to make independent films than in any previous decade. In 1958, the Nagra 4th-inch magnetic tape recorder was invented, which basically meant that you can make portable sound sync to film way easier. Sound stages kept a lot of filming indoors. This sort of invention helped allow filmmakers to take sound on the road. Suddenly, you also had a clear, lightweight, portable, quiet, maneuverable handheld cameras. And the cost of 16mm film stock in the 1960s was sinking. That means that independent filmmakers could have portable, maneuverable cameras with sync sound that didn't cost that much money that they could take out in the world with them, making this type of filmmaking way more manageable and affordable outside of a studio system context where you had big budget backing. While the technological inventions of lightweight portable cameras would help facilitate independent fictional films, it was also quite influential to documentary movements in the early 1960s, the aesthetics of which would also influence many of the filmmakers who started making New Hollywood films. The direct cinema movement, which emerged in the United States, as well as the cinema verite movement, a documentary movement in France and Canada, really wanted to shift away from the more educational-based, argumentative documentaries of decades past. Instead, direct cinema wanted to follow subjects as they lived their lives, with spontaneity, capturing life uncontrolled, events as they happened. I'm going to show you a quick clip from a video essay that discusses how technological possibilities aligned with new documentary objectives to create this new type of documentary movement, direct cinema.
When when the night is left you cold and feeling sad. I will show you that it cannot be so bad. Forget the one who went and made you cry. I'll sing a
The invention of direct cinema was a pinnacle moment in the history of documentary films. The invention of light, handheld cameras, provided for a more intimate and close-up view of reality.
Yeah, that's a good song, man.
Using this technique of documenting films provided the viewer to see a more personal side of the characters documented. Using the style of film is the closest way to truly capture the aspects of reality. Films like Primary, Don't Look Back, and the Maysles Brothers' Salesman are prime examples of what direct cinema is all about. Robert Drew's 1960 documentary film, Primary, used techniques of direct cinema that shaped the story of the film. The close-up shots and close-quarters encounters with individuals allowed the viewer to see how people felt in each scene. It allowed for us as viewers to develop empathy and have a sense of care for the individuals like no other way of documentary films have done before.
And I said, I want to place a camera with you. He said, why should I do that? And I said, this is a new form of journalism, and we're simply going to watch what happens. We're not going to direct, we're not going to light, we're not going to ask you to do anything, but we have to be there. And he said, well, why should I do it? And I said, because this will be a new form of history also, and it'll be a true history of what happened in Wisconsin.
Now, I will also mention that it wasn't just the late 1950s in which filmmakers started experimenting with more artisanal or independent modes of film. The United States has a long history of avant-garde or artisanal filmmaking. Filmmakers like Maya Deren, who some of you might be familiar with, had been experimenting with making films outside of a Hollywood context for years. These tend to be made by individuals or very small groups of collaborators, influenced by the filmmakers alone, using kind of low-budget handheld cameras or for low budgets, or made for kind of not only film collectives or small groups, but maybe a museum or an institution of education. These were really a minor practice compared to Hollywood, but as the 1960s kind of amped up or started leading into the late 1960s, many of these art scenes in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York would prove very influential to the artists who were interested in making new types of films at that time. While Hollywood productions obviously took place in California, New York had a very vibrant arts and culture scene in the 1960s. Music was fresh, poetry was hip, the Beat Generation kind of created a new countercultural scene, and many actors who, studied method acting came out of this new theatrical environment of New York. Early independent filmmakers, people like John Cassavetes, also came out of the scene, who made films that emphasized improvisation and method acting. He himself was an actor who would star in some new Hollywood films, but his film like Shadows explored issues of gender and race and identity politics before the kind of rise of New Hollywood a decade later. But in the late 1950s, this was more of an anomaly. In the late 1960s, this would become the norm.
So says the London Evening Standard. So says London's Daily Herald. And so says the Daily Mail. Motion picture critics around the world acclaim America's newest film triumph. Listen to the London Times. Few films in recent years have received more critical acclaim, and Shadows deserves it. Again and again, the raves repeat their acclamation.
Please don't touch me. Please don't touch me. I want to go home.
And the Daily Mirror describes Lelia Goldoni's performance as blazingly brilliant. And the Daily Express says this: the most truthful love scene you have ever seen. Shadows, directed by John Cassavetes, breaks all the barriers of conventional filmmaking. Actually filmed in New York City, Shadows now returns to be hailed by American critics. Esquire's movie critic Dwight MacDonald notes the critical acclaim it has received and says, "For this is a real story of real people living in the shadows of the neon-crazy streets of Manhattan." And more cheers from the press. Humor and a wonderful sense of realism pervade the picture.
Forward! I don't want you around hurting my sister. I don't want you to hurt anything of mine. Now go. Just get out.
Here are scenes in which you not only feel you're an eavesdropper, but an intruder.
But you remember, you told me to come here!
Leo Lerman in Mademoiselle says, in John Cassavetes' Shadows, the quality of heart is so apparent that audiences come away feeling that they have participated actively in the life it presents. And in Vogue, Aileen Talmy says, people will be talking about Shadows. A tremendous splash. And Harper's Bazaar says this about Shadows: what happens is often moving, sometimes frightening, often very funny, and always exciting.
At the same time, culture was changing massively. In New York and San Francisco, disaffected youth kind of started creating bohemian niches in American society. Even if American society was not totally on board with the counterculture, there was underground societies with new attitudes or emerging, changing attitudes about social relationships, sexuality, drug use, drinking, free love, that was really gathering steam at this time.
Now, hippies generally comprised only a small portion of societies in big urban centers. However, there was this allure of the hippie as this new cultural icon that reflected changing attitudes within American society as a whole.
In 1968, almost every American knew what these were: hippies. A few of the estimated 16 million cultural rebels who abandoned 1950s notions about how life in America should be lived. And by 1968, almost everyone in America knew what these people were too: student protesters, activists, part of a small but vocal group of political rebels who were fighting not only to end a war, but to transform, even dismantle, the American system. And this is Jerry Rubin. To try to make sense of the 60s, you have to listen to what he was telling America in 1968.
You know, America is so obsessed with bad breath and with underarm deodorant. These are the biggest problems in the world. If you watch television at prime times, advertising is not concerned about poverty, not concerned about race oppression, not concerned about the police, but the biggest problem is your hair groomed, and what's it like under your arms, and do you have bad breath? And this is the American obsession. And so I think that a generation of kids which says, we don't care about your concepts of cleanliness is a revolutionary generation.
To understand the effect Jerry Rubin and others like him had on America, you have to see them for what they were. They were people who had most Americans convinced that hippies and political activists marched hand in hand. But for the most part, they never did.
February 1964.
We came here at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 to see them, and all they do is push you farther and farther away, and then they don't even let you see them.
I was in college in early '64, and I read in the San Francisco Chronicle that a rock and roll band from England was going to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. So I thought I would go to the Commons room in my dorm and watch it. And I figured there'd be 5 or 6 people there, as there usually were, and we'd have the usual argument about what to watch, and I hoped I would get to see this. And instead, there were hundreds of people in this room, and everybody there for the same reason. God knows why. I think there must have been some sense that it's time for something new to happen, and maybe this is going to be it. The music was something that you could talk about with your friends and that you couldn't talk about with people who were older than you. It gave people a sense of generational solidarity and a sense that they were different, and a sense different from the rest of the country, different from any other generation in American history, that they were in some ways special and blessed. And it gave them a sense of being embattled, of being considered outsiders, reprobates, bad people.
I wanna be a Beatle. I never pull my hair. So I can look just like a...
These kids may not look like it, but they are the leading edge of a youth rebellion, a movement that would ignite one of the most powerful and pervasive cultural shifts in United States history.
The hippest boy in town. We do what we want. We say what we want. We wear what we want. We look exactly the way we want to, yeah. The time has come for the whole world to know that we all can conform to the rules.
To understand how and why so many people stopped conforming to the rules, remember that appearances are misleading. And especially in the 1960s, appearances were very important. A perfect example is hair.
Do you think these haircuts have come to stay?
Well, this one has, you know, stuck on good and proper now.
Is that a Beatle haircut you've got?
Yes.
How'd you work it out?
Well, I just let my hair flop around until it's all messy.
What do your parents say about it?
They don't like it.
Are you a boy? Are you a girl? With your long blonde hair, you look like a girl.
You would physically get approached and, called gay or fags or queers or whatever it was, a lot of people did not understand long hair at all. It was really a threat to them. It really flew in the face of conventionalism. And long hair was a flag for someone. You could see somebody across the street And if they had long hair, you knew how they thought. You knew that they were into good music. You knew that they were into a reasonable life. You knew that their thought processes. You knew that they probably hated the government. You knew that they probably knew where the best drugs were. You knew that it was someone that you could just nod to and have this understanding between. Anybody that had really short hair, you knew what short hair meant. Strange, isn't it?
Well, there are a great number of people, they stopped taking haircuts altogether, mainly around colleges, number one. Number two, even those which do take haircuts, they come so in such long intervals it isn't funny anymore.
A style, a flag of membership, a conscious act of defiance. What made long hair such a confusing and profound symbol was that it could mean any and all of these things. And to the dismay of the older generation, millions of young people suddenly began to care a great deal about looking like they didn't care how they looked.
Sometimes I was ashamed to introduce them to some people. I just thought of that. Because they were just, you know, sometimes the way they dressed and the way they appeared, it just didn't quite suit me to introduce them to some of my friends.
If parents were uncomfortable with the way their sons and daughters were beginning to look, imagine how confused they'd become when they saw how this younger generation was starting to behave.
The counterculture was just drenched with eroticism. The very act of having long hair is an act of sensuality. Then you add to that the fact that there was also an enormous amount of sex, much more. I think there's no doubt that people were having an awful lot more sex than people of the same age had had a decade before. Certainly in the 50s. I mean, I became interested in girls in the middle 50s. And believe me, it was all talk until the 1960s.
My baby does the hanky-panky. My baby does the hanky-panky. My baby does the hanky-panky. My baby does the hanky-panky.
Physical desire is very normal, and it happens, and sometimes everything just comes down to a very basic level, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think that sex is just much groovier when there's love, you know. There's a lot more happening, but there's nothing wrong with just sex for sex.
Such talk was not only provocative, but at the time, downright immoral. This generation seemed determined to tear down conventions that had, in 1950s America, defined proper behavior. And it's somewhat ironic to think that scientists would unwittingly pour gasoline on the fires by coming up with the surest contraceptive ever devised. Fear of pregnancy, perhaps the most powerful sexual restraint, was undone.
Keep up the grass, the sign says, keep up the grass. Keep up the grass, the sign says, keep up.
Use of another drug, marijuana, would further separate members of this generation not only from their parents, but also from their inhibitions.
Grass was important because it did describe us, like them and us, kind of. Of course, we all grew up 18, 19, 20 years of being rigid little, puppets or something, and suddenly the grass relaxed us. It allowed us to be the people we really are, or really were.
So films of the late 1960s would reflect this growing fascination with the counterculture. Even if you weren't part of these niche subsects of society that practice countercultural behaviors, going to the cinema, you could experience it secondhand. And films definitely tried to do so. And if they weren't reflecting the shifting cultural behaviors, they were reflecting shifting politics in a new American society. In the late 1960s, many young people in the United States were yearning for something different, something new from Hollywood. While they weren't seeing what they wanted in Hollywood, they were seeing art films. As Hollywood distribution changed, that meant that art films from Europe would be shown on American screens, especially in urban centers where artists would be located. So places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York would get films like Breathless and Daisies, and directors who are emerging in the US would be watching these films, especially as film schools emerged. Many of the filmmakers who would become prominent in New Hollywood were attending schools like NYU and UCLA to study filmmaking for the first time. Many of them had come back from experiences abroad or had gone to college on the GI Bill and were interested in bringing their personal experiences to the screen, kind of influenced by these art film cultures elsewhere. Well, the 1950s also brought a wave of suburbanization and conformity and consumerism among middle-class affluent white Americans. It also was a time of increasing political instability. The Cold War was still raging. Civil rights had come to the forefront of debates about equity in the United States, and there was a lot of political volatility. In the 1960s, major leaders were assassinated. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy were all assassinated, sometimes on national television. In the wake of those events and amidst periods of kind of harsh police brutality, urban rebellions emerged in cities throughout the United States. There was also increased divisions and protests against those social norms that maintained societal differences. Not only was the civil rights movement shifting to a more Black power-oriented movement, we had the emergence of an LGBT movement in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the feminist movement fighting for gender equity in the workplace and in homes, with kind of Roe v. Wade being a critical political rallying point for women's rights to choose. You, of course, also had increasing distrust of the political establishment. Cold War paranoia and surveillance culture was at an all-time high. The government had had many snafus, including things like the Bay of Pigs. There was reason to distrust the government, Watergate being one of them in 1972. However, one of the main fractures in American society was divergent opinions about the Vietnam War. So student movements amped up to protest the Vietnam War and protest for civil rights in the 1960s. Some of these turned violent, like Kent State in 1970. The Vietnam War created a political as well as generational divide in the United States. After the successful intervention of U.S. forces in World War II, and watching countries in Eastern Europe begin to side with the socialist USSR, the U.S. and allied nations in Europe wanted to safeguard democracy at all costs. As such, the Truman Doctrine indicated that the U.S. would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under the threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. This led the U.S. to enter the Korean conflict in the early 1950s and continue to intervene in political upheavals and coups throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. There was this fear of what Eisenhower called the domino effect, where if one country fell to communism, another would. However, countries outside of Europe fought differently. It fought in ways that the U.S. didn't know what to do with. While these were all separate conflicts, U.S. intervention into wars in Korea and Vietnam were absolutely efforts to maintain a balance of power between the U.S. and the USSR with little regard for what was actually happening to those individual nations of Vietnam or Korea. Entering into the Vietnam conflict in the early 1960s brought first U.S. Green Berets, and it turned out that it was a lot harder to fight than the U.S. anticipated. Now, even if we can see political merits to supporting World War II and the U.S. efforts to fight Nazi terror, it didn't mean that during World War II, everyone was on board with fighting a political conflict overseas. And this distrust or concern over entering foreign military wars became increasingly true during the Vietnam era. Now, it seemed at the time that the U.S. couldn't even provide securities to its own citizens in U.S. cities, as the civil rights struggle persevered, let alone take care of people outside of the country. I will say that the majority of Americans did actually support the war effort in Vietnam. However, as young American men were conscripted to fight without really understanding or wanting to, many started questioning why they were fighting and what values they were actually fighting for. And many young citizens defected to Canada or became draft dodgers. Disillusionment in the American military intervention in Vietnam, or the Vietnam War, was really amplified by two key events in the late 1960s. The first of these events was the Tet Offensive. Basically, the North Vietnamese attacked more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam, where US and South Vietnamese forces were located. Now, the US and the South Vietnamese forces were able to hold off the attacks. However, this was a massive blow to everyone. The North Vietnamese had heavy casualties, but they had a strategic victory. Basically, the North Vietnamese proved that they did not care how many lives were lost if they would overall win the battle in the long run. And the US and the South Vietnamese were unsure that they were willing to lose that many in this war. This attack marked a turning point in the Vietnam War and the beginning of a slow, painful American withdrawal from the region, without any victory settlement. Now, the other more horrifying event was the My Lai Massacre of 1968. Essentially, a company of American soldiers went into a town, My Lai, in Vietnam, and brutally killed, raped, and pillaged an entire village. Women, children, elderly, no one was spared. More than 500 people were slaughtered by American citizens. Young girls and women were raped and mutilated. Making this even worse, US Army officers covered up the carnage for a year before it was leaked to the American press, and this sparked a firestorm of international outrage. It caused American citizens reading newspapers at home to question what in the hell was happening in Vietnam, even if this was just an isolated kind of occurrence in one village with one military unit. But also, why weren't they told? Why is the government covering things up? It created this deep level of distrust that perhaps has never been repaired, and really amplified anti-war sentiment in the United States, kind of leading, alongside the Tet Offensive, the US to begin slow withdrawals.
A new generation of young Americans in the post-World War II era felt alienated from patriarchal conformity and consumerist culture. Many young Americans were longing for something new. They felt disillusioned and critical of American politics and society. The filmmakers who became integral to New Hollywood had watched the news. They saw body bags full of American citizens. They were informed by politics of the time and were stylistically moved by the art filmmaking in Europe, as well as the politically engaged cinemas of Latin American countries for a lesser degree. In the next presentation, I will show clips and discuss how the social political changes that manifested in American society of the 1960s emerged in the form of new themes and styles for American cinema in the late 1960s as well.
To summarize,